He was arrested in silence, shoved to the ground by a cop who didn't recognize him, only to face a courtroom where truth and lies collided. But when Keanu Reeves finally stood up to speak, the entire room changed. What was he hiding? And why did one sentence leave the judge speechless? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The Los Angeles night had a chill that clung to the skin, the kind that crept in through the seams of a worn hoodie. Keanu Reeves walked alone beneath dim streetlights, his silhouette unassuming. He had just wrapped another long day on a low-budget indie film shoot. No entourage, no trailers, just an honest story and a tiny crew. It was the kind of project he took on not for money, but for meaning, and tonight, he was tired. He wasn't far from the hotel, but downtown's maze of one-ways and alley corners was unfamiliar in the dark. He stopped near a shuttered florist shop, lifting his phone to double-check directions. A soft glow lit his face. His fingers swiped across the screen as he looked for the right turn. That's when the patrol car rolled up. Its engine was low, almost like a warning. Keanu looked up casually, expecting it to drive past. But it slowed, then stopped. The door opened with a click. A tall officer stepped out, stocky, square jaw, and carrying an attitude heavy enough to be felt across the sidewalk. "Hey," the officer called. "What are you doing out here?" Keanu turned fully to face him. "Just trying to find my hotel," he said calmly. The officer, Bradley Simmons, narrowed his eyes. His flashlight beam hit Keanu's chest, then his face. "You look nervous." Keanu blinked against the light. "I'm just tired, sir. Long day." Simmons stepped closer. "Let's see some eyes." Keanu reached slowly, carefully, retrieving his wallet. He handed it over. Simmons took the license but didn't really examine it. His attention remained fixed on the hoodie, the unshaven jaw, the stillness. "What's in the bag?" he asked, pointing to the small backpack slung over Keanu's shoulder. "Just a script, some personal things. I can open it if you'd like." Simmons didn't answer. Instead, he circled around behind Keanu. "Why are you standing near a closed shop?" "I just stopped to look at my phone. I didn't go inside." "You know we've had break-ins around here, right?" Keanu didn't answer that. He simply held his ground, his posture relaxed but respectful. That silence, steady, patient, made Simmons tense up. "Turn around," he barked. Keanu looked confused. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Turn around and place your hands on the hood." There was a pause. Then Keanu slowly did as instructed. His hands touched cold metal. The air changed. In one swift move, Simmons grabbed his arm, twisted it up behind his back, and shoved him forward. The cuffs clicked shut. "You're being detained for acting suspicious and resisting instructions." "I didn't resist," Keanu said quietly. But Simmons wasn't listening. He shoved Keanu toward the back seat of the cruiser, opened the door, and pushed him inside. The car door slammed. Keanu sat in silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain who he was. And Simmons still didn't recognize him. The inside of the patrol car was colder than the street. Keanu sat still, his wrists tight in the metal cuffs. The city lights blurred outside the window as the car began to move, turning down a quiet avenue. He said nothing. He didn't ask questions. He had already seen how questions were received tonight. From the front seat, Officer Simmons radioed in the stop. His tone was casual, almost smug. "Possible burglary suspect. Male, mid-40s, suspicious behavior, claims to be lost." He paused, then added, "Uncooperative." Keanu heard every word. None of them were true. But they were recorded now, stitched into the narrative before he ever had a chance to speak. It wasn't the first time he had read about it. It was just the first time it was his name in the report. The car came to a halt outside a small station. Simmons got out, opened the back door, and gestured for Keanu to follow. Let's go." Still silent, Keanu stepped out. His legs were stiff from the position. The officer led him inside, past a yawning desk sergeant and a row of fluorescent lights that hummed too loud in the stillness. There was no yelling, no confrontation. Only the sound of procedure grinding forward. "Empty your pockets," Simmons said as they reached a booking desk. Keanu complied. Phone. Wallet. Room key. A folded piece of paper with handwritten notes from that day's filming. Nothing more. The sergeant at the desk glanced at the items, then at Keanu. "Name?" "Keanu Reeves." The sergeant blinked, looked again. "Like the actor?" Keanu just nodded once. Simmons snorted. "Yeah, sure, we get movie stars every Friday." Keanu said nothing. The sergeant shrugged and entered the name. Simmons moved behind him to fill in the charges. Resisting arrest, suspicious activity, possibly casing a storefront. Keanu closed his eyes. The charges weren't real, but they would stick unless something broke the rhythm. He'd seen it happen to others. Men who didn't look right in the wrong neighborhood. Men who asked too many questions, or not enough. He'd donated to organizations that fought this. He'd spoken in support of awareness. But this wasn't a campaign. This was real, personal, humiliating. And the worst part was knowing how often this story played out for people who couldn't prove who they were, who didn't have cameras or names that carried weight. He wasn't trying to make a point. He wasn't trying to provoke anyone. He just wanted to get back to his hotel. But now, his quiet night had turned into a legal battle. Simmons looked pleased with himself as he handed off the paperwork. "That'll teach him," he muttered. Keanu didn't respond. He had nothing to say. But that silence, as always, was not surrender. It was preparation. The holding cell was small, barely lit, with walls stained by years of boredom and neglect. Keanu sat on the bench, hands resting loosely in his lap, cuffs now removed, but the redness still lingering on his wrists. He didn't pace. He didn't shout. He waited. The door clanged shut behind him, sealing the quiet. Hours passed. He didn't know how many. No phone, no clock, just the drip of a leaky pipe and the occasional buzz of fluorescent lights outside. A younger officer walked by, stopped, peered in. "You really look like that guy," the officer muttered. "The movie guy." Keanu looked up, gave a small nod. "Why didn't you say something?" the officer asked. But Keanu didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, because it wouldn't have mattered. If Simmons hadn't listened when he was calm and respectful, he wouldn't have listened to a name. And what did that say about the world? That truth only mattered when it came wrapped in fame? The officer lingered, then walked away, leaving Keanu alone again. Meanwhile, in the front of the station, Officer Simmons was holding court, laughing with another patrolman, retelling the arrest as if it were a joke. Guy was real quiet, real smug, like he thought he was above it all. "Maybe he was just scared," the other cop said, only half serious. Simmons waved it off. He fit the profile. You know the type. Back in the cell, Keanu exhaled slowly. His jaw was clenched, but not from anger, from restraint. He had spent years learning how to manage pain, how to move through trauma without letting it define him. But this was different. This was a theft of dignity. He thought about the role he'd wrapped hours earlier, a quiet janitor who stood up to corporate injustice. Fiction, of course, but fiction often carried more truth than people realized. Now, here he was, stripped of identity by a stranger's assumptions, reduced to the guy in the hoodie. Outside, the city moved on, but inside the precinct, something had already shifted. The young officer returned with a file in hand, eyes wide. Sir," he said to the sergeant, "you need to see this." The sergeant took the file. His eyes scanned the booking name again, then stopped. "Wait a minute." He looked up at Simmons. "You said this guy was being combative, that he was resisting?" Simmons shrugged. He didn't follow commands, was acting strange. The sergeant's gaze narrowed. You didn't recognize him? Why would I? Simmons replied. But now, the story wasn't holding as tight. Doubt crept into the cracks. Back in the cell, Keanu finally stood. His hands relaxed at his sides, the stiffness fading. He wasn't broken, not even close. Because what Officer Simmons didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this man he tried to silence had spent a lifetime listening, learning, and preparing for moments just like this. Moments when silence would turn into a voice that couldn't be ignored. The concrete bench offered no comfort. Keanu sat with his back against the cool wall, arms loosely folded over his chest, head tilted forward in rest, not sleep. There was no pillow, no blanket, no privacy, only a metal toilet and the quiet hum of forgotten lives echoing off cell walls. The hours ticked by slowly, the night thick and without mercy. No one offered him a phone call. No one asked if he was okay. No special treatment. He was just another man with a number. The arresting officer had processed him like everyone else. Fingerprints, mugshot, property bag, his wallet, phone, and room key now sat somewhere in a bin marked Reeves. When the cell door clicked open at sunrise, a young officer stepped in. He looked barely old enough to vote, his uniform too new, his expression too soft. He carried a clipboard but didn't look down at it. His eyes were fixed on the man in the hoodie, who hadn't spoken all night. The officer blinked once, then again. "Sir," he said, his voice unsteady, Are you Keanu Reeves?" Keanu slowly lifted his gaze, calm, unreadable. He gave the faintest nod. The officer stepped back slightly, unsure what to do next. "Wait here," he said quickly, and disappeared down the hallway. Minutes later, murmurs stirred through the station like the beginning of a wave. Doors opened, footsteps grew faster, names were whispered. Keanu Reeves? Like the actor? The sergeant who had dismissed him the night before now held the booking report in trembling hands, scanning it again, then again. Officer Simmons stood nearby, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You didn't recognize him?" the sergeant asked. Simmons shook his head. Didn't matter who he was. He looked suspicious. The sergeant's expression hardened. It matters now. TMZ already picked up the arrest record. In the next room, Keanu was handed his belongings without a word. His coat still smelled of the city's dirt. His phone was dead. His room key cracked. "You're being released on bail," the sergeant said, not meeting his eyes. "Charges still stand, for now." Keanu took the items, nodded once, and walked out into the morning light. Across the street, 2 cameras waited. Snap. Flash. Snap. A man with a beard and tired eyes. A hoodie. Handcuff marks still red around his wrists. No quotes, no statements, just a picture. By noon, the photo was everywhere. Headlines ran without fact. Actor detained after late-night altercation. Keanu Reeves involved in police incident. Star, or suspect. Public opinion didn't wait for explanation. It never did. People debated in threads and comments, divided between disbelief and condemnation. Why was he out so late? Why didn't he say who he was? Was he hiding something? But Keanu stayed silent. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't post an Instagram video or tweet a denial. He went back to his hotel room, alone, and sat quietly. As emails flooded in, as his publicist panicked, and as the world asked for his side of the story. He waited, not because he was afraid, but because the truth needed the right room to echo in. And that room wasn't Twitter. It was the courtroom. The hotel manager looked shaken when Keanu stepped into the lobby. She stammered out a welcome, offered breakfast, and apologized profusely without saying what for. He nodded politely, said he was fine, and took the elevator up without another word. Behind him, whispers traveled between reception staff like wildfire. Upstairs, the suite felt different, colder, not because anything had changed, but because everything had. Keanu placed the cracked room key on the nightstand and plugged in his phone. As it powered on, dozens of notifications lit up in rapid succession. Missed calls, voicemails, texts from colleagues, friends, even journalists he hadn't spoken to in years. His publicist had sent 20 messages, each one more urgent than the last. Call me. Crisis brewing. Damage control needed now. Why didn't you tell them who you were? Keanu sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, phone in hand. He didn't call back. Not yet. Instead, he opened the browser and searched his own name. The mugshot was already viral. His eyes half closed, beard unkempt, shadows under his lids. The caption read, "Actor or threat?" The comments were a flood, some defending him, others disgusted, most just curious, feeding on drama like oxygen. He closed the screen, set the phone down. There was no press statement that could fix what had already been shaped by silence and misjudgment. And that was the point. If the story was going to be told, it had to be more than just defense. It had to become a window into something bigger. The next morning, Benjamin Carter knocked on the hotel door at 7:00 a.m. sharp. Keanu opened it already dressed in slacks and a dark button-up, his demeanor quiet, calm. Benjamin, a defense attorney barely in his 30s, looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was crooked. His messenger bag overflowed with files and notes. "You sure about this?" Benjamin asked. Keanu nodded. "I don't want a PR spin. I want to speak in court." Benjamin hesitated. "You realize what they've already said, right? That you were uncooperative, that you fit a profile, that Simmons is decorated and—" "I know," Keanu said. Benjamin sighed, took out a file and handed it to him. "Here's what you've been charged with. Misdemeanor loitering, resisting arrest, suspicious conduct. It sounds small, but they'll paint you as difficult, arrogant, entitled." "I was quiet," Keanu said. "Exactly," Benjamin replied. "That's how they'll frame it." There was a pause. Then Keanu looked him in the eye and said quietly, "Let them." Benjamin blinked. "You want to go through with this?" "I want them to see what they did to someone they didn't recognize," Keanu said, voice firm. "Because it's not just about me." And that was the moment Benjamin realized this wasn't about a mugshot anymore. This was about a mirror. 2 days later, Keanu sat in a closed room inside Benjamin's office while the legal team reviewed evidence. They combed through every second of security footage, scoured body cam logs, and searched public databases for any record of Officer Simmons's prior complaints. Most of it turned up clean. Officially, Simmons was a model officer. Commendations, promotions, a spotless file. But Keanu noticed what wasn't there. Missing timestamps on patrol logs. 5 prior cases where body cam footage was listed as malfunctioning. And each of those cases involved individuals from marginalized communities. That's when Benjamin knew this wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a pattern. Still, without video evidence from the night of the arrest, they had little to stand on. Until the phone rang. It was a man named Darren Watts, a night shift dishwasher at a nearby diner. He'd seen the incident from across the street, and he had recorded it on his old Android. Shaky footage, dim lighting, but clear audio. He had been too afraid to come forward until he recognized Keanu's face on the news. Benjamin played the clip once, then again. The words rang through the room like thunder. "Men like you don't get to question me." That was Officer Simmons's voice, loud and crystal clear. The video also captured Keanu's steady tone, not shouting, not resisting, only asking why he was being detained. The clip ended with the sound of a thud, Keanu being slammed onto the hood of the car. Benjamin sat back, stunned. This changes everything. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He sat still for a moment, then said, "We wait to use it. Let him speak first." Benjamin looked at him, puzzled. "You want him to lie under oath?" "No," Keanu said softly. "I want him to believe he can." News outlets were still running the story. Social media teetered between support and skepticism. Some believed the charges were a misunderstanding. Others painted Keanu as difficult, using his fame to avoid accountability. A few questioned if it was even really him in the photo. Keanu didn't respond to any of it. Not a statement, not a tweet. He let the silence grow. Because sometimes silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. A week later, the arraignment was scheduled. Keanu walked into the courtroom with no entourage, no fanfare, just Benjamin by his side. Reporters waited outside. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. Keanu kept his head down. When asked how he pled, he spoke just 2 words. "Not guilty." The prosecution smirked. Officer Simmons, seated near the front, didn't even glance at him. To Simmons, it was just another case. Another name to process, another report to submit. But this time, the name was louder than he knew. He just hadn't realized it yet. And soon, the world would learn. This wasn't a story about a celebrity avoiding trouble. This was a story about how anyone, no matter how quiet, how calm, or how known, could be misjudged in the wrong light, especially when silence spoke louder than guilt ever could. The courthouse was already buzzing by 8 a.m., the air thick with curiosity. News vans lined the curb, their antennas pointing toward the sky like skeletal trees, waiting to catch something worthy of broadcast. Most people didn't know what they were there to see. All they had was a headline: Keanu Reeves arrested for resisting arrest, and a few grainy photos of a man in a hoodie being pinned against a police car. No context, just assumption. Inside, the courtroom was colder, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The benches filled slowly, a mix of reporters, curious onlookers, and those who simply had nothing better to do that day. The buzz quieted when Keanu walked in. He didn't move like a celebrity. No designer suit, no sunglasses, no entourage. Just a plain navy blazer, gray slacks, and that familiar, unassuming walk. A few people whispered his name, uncertain. Others stared, squinting, trying to match the man before them with the movie star they thought they knew. Sitting beside him at the defense table was Benjamin Carter. Young, nervous, and clearly out of place among the seasoned legal crowd. He shuffled papers, checked his notes again, and tried to ignore the cameras pointed in his direction. Keanu leaned in once and asked if he was ready. Benjamin nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. Across the room, Officer Bradley Simmons adjusted his uniform as he took the stand. He wore his badge like armor and his expression like victory. Every movement was deliberate, polished. He answered the prosecutor's questions with the ease of someone who had told the story many times before. "I responded to a report of a suspicious individual loitering near a closed business after midnight," Simmons began, voice firm and direct. "I approached calmly and asked for ID. The defendant became agitated, raised his voice, refused to comply. I attempted to de-escalate. He became aggressive. I feared for my safety and placed him under arrest." There were nods from the jury, a few furrowed brows. Simmons continued without missing a beat. L resisted, reached toward his pocket suddenly. "I interpreted that as a threat to my safety. At that point, I restrained him using reasonable force." The prosecutor asked if he had reason to believe the man was dangerous. Simmons nodded. His behavior was erratic. He didn't answer questions directly. He challenged my authority. That's often a sign of someone hiding something. The courtroom was quiet, except for the scratch of pens and the low hum of the ceiling fan. Benjamin scribbled notes, but didn't interrupt. He glanced once at Keanu, who remained still, his face unreadable. From the jury box, it was hard to ignore how official Simmons looked. How composed. How convincing. His words painted a picture of control and duty, the kind of image people wanted to believe, and for now, they did. But something else lingered under the surface, a quiet tension, a question unspoken. Why would Keanu Reeves, of all people, resist arrest? Benjamin Carter stood slowly. His palms were sweating, and he could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing against his spine. He adjusted his tie, slightly crooked, and walked toward the jury with a manila folder in one hand and a yellow legal pad in the other. "No objections to Officer Simmons's recollection of events," Benjamin began. "But we ask the court to consider this. Perception is not always truth, especially when power and prejudice blur the lens." Some jurors straightened. The judge raised an eyebrow. It wasn't the opening they expected from someone so young. Benjamin turned toward Simmons, now seated confidently with his arms crossed. "Officer Simmons, did you know who the defendant was at the time of arrest?" "No," Simmons said flatly. "Have you since learned who he is?" "I have." Benjamin nodded, letting the silence linger. "Would it be fair to say that your actions, your description of his behavior, was shaped by how he looked, not how he acted?" Simmons frowned. "He was loitering at night, wearing a hood, acting strangely." "Strangely how?" Will didn't answer questions the way most people do. He was quiet, evasive. Benjamin paused. "Is it possible that someone could be quiet because they're tired, or disoriented, or simply respectful?" Simmons didn't answer immediately. "Possible, but not likely." Benjamin took a breath. "Would you describe the defendant as aggressive?" "Yeah." Benjamin walked to the table and picked up a printed still frame from the body cam footage. He raised it. This image, captured at the moment of the arrest, shows Mr. Reeves with his hands clearly raised, calm, compliant. "Is that what aggression looks like to you?" Simmons hesitated. "It's a split sec. You can't judge from a single frame." Benjamin nodded. "So, perception can mislead?" The officer didn't answer. Benjamin turned to the jury. "There are no weapons, no threats, no raised voice. Just a man trying to find his way back to his hotel after filming a scene where he played someone struggling. A man who chose not to correct his arresting officer, even as he was shoved against a car, because he didn't want to escalate the situation, because he feared how it might end." He looked around the room. "Ask yourselves, what kind of man doesn't scream when falsely arrested? What kind of man remains calm even when he's treated like a criminal for simply wearing a hoodie and walking alone?" No one spoke. Benjamin returned to his seat. Keanu gave him a small nod, the kind that carried more weight than any compliment. And even though Benjamin still felt the pressure of being out of his league, he knew he had just shifted the room. Not fully, but enough to make them think, and that was the beginning. The judge called for a brief recess, and the courtroom slowly emptied into hushed conversations and curious glances. Outside, the media buzzed louder than before. Journalists, bloggers, and camera crews speculated wildly about Keanu Reeves' presence in court. Some claimed it was performance art. Others whispered about a new civil rights documentary. A few simply doubted the story altogether. After all, how could someone like Keanu be arrested over something so small? But back inside, as the courtroom refilled and the judge returned to the bench, the gravity returned with it. Officer Simmons took the stand once more. This time, he was more careful. His words were slower, less dramatic. He had seen the courtroom shift ever so slightly, and he was trying to control the narrative again. "I believed I was in danger," he repeated. "I've been in situations before that escalated fast. I trusted my instincts." Benjamin rose. "Did your instincts include asking him where he was staying?" "No." "Did they include checking his ID before putting him in cuffs?" "No." "Did they include any attempt to de-escalate before using force?" Simmons didn't answer. Benjamin walked forward. "You say you feared for your safety, but do you remember the exact words Mr. Reeves said to you before the arrest?" "I don't." Benjamin looked toward the judge. "Permission to play Exhibit B?" The judge nodded. The court monitor lit up. A short clip from a bystander's phone played. Muffled, shaky footage, but enough. Keanu's voice unmistakable and calm. "I'm just looking for my hotel. I'm not resisting. Why am I being stopped?" Then Simmons's reply, caught on audio. "Don't question me, just do what I say." The video ended. Benjamin let the silence stretch. Then he looked to the jury. That was the moment of escalation, not shouting, not aggression, a question. He turned back to Simmons. "Is that the threat you were referring to?" Simmons stared down, jaw clenched. Benjamin returned to the defense table, calm but intense. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you're seeing here isn't just a conflict between two men. It's a conflict between perception and truth, between power and silence, and between how the world treats someone who speaks quietly and someone who shouts over them." He sat. The prosecutor stood next, his voice firm, doing damage control. The officer acted based on the situation as he saw it. No one disputes that Mr. Reeves was calm. But officers can't afford to take risks. When someone refuses to comply quickly, that's a signal. He turned to the jury. "Don't let fame blind you. Mr. Reeves is a respected actor, but this isn't about Hollywood. This is about law and order." The courtroom buzzed again. But now, the jury wasn't nodding as easily. They had seen something new. No, and Keanu hadn't said a word yet. But when he did, it wouldn't be for sympathy. It would be for truth. And it was coming. The courtroom was still tense when Officer Simmons returned to the stand for further questioning. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, clearly aware that the attention in the room had shifted slightly after the video playback. Yet he pushed forward with his version of the events, voice steady and eyes locked on the jury, as if daring them to doubt him. Air of species. "And speak much at first," Simmons said. "That's what made him dangerous. You never know what someone's capable of when they don't answer basic questions." Benjamin stood at the defense table but didn't interrupt. He glanced at Keanu, who sat with his hands calmly folded, his posture relaxed, eyes focused. No sign of defensiveness, no tension, just quiet resolve. Simmons continued. "He looked at me and then reached into his jacket, fast. That's when I grabbed him and restrained him. I've seen too many situations go wrong. I followed protocol." Keanu leaned slightly toward Benjamin and whispered, "Let him climb." Benjamin nodded once, barely noticeable. His fingers gripped a legal pad, resisting the urge to stand and object. But he stayed seated. This was about timing. Simmons was gaining confidence with each sentence. He became verbally aggressive. I remember him raising his voice, asking why he was being stopped. He was escalating the situation, not me. In the gallery, a few eyebrows rose. There was no record of shouting in the video, no visible aggression. Still, the officer's uniform lent his words weight. The judge leaned forward, taking notes. Benjamin's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained neutral. He looked toward the jury. A few members seemed uncertain. The seeds of doubt were still small. The prosecutor stood for a quick follow-up. "Officer Simmons, in your professional opinion, was this man resisting arrest?" "Yes, absolutely. His posture, his refusal to answer directly, his motion into the jacket, all indicators of potential danger." "No further questions?" Benjamin rose slowly. "Your Honor, we reserve cross-examination for later." The judge nodded. Keanu sat still. He hadn't spoken in court, hadn't testified, hadn't offered a single defense. To the press and public outside, it was confusing. To the jury, it was frustrating. To Simmons, it was irritating. But to Benjamin, it was part of something bigger. He flipped through his notes and added a single line at the bottom of the page. "Truth waits." Because Keanu wasn't in a rush. He had seen how noise drowned honesty. And he knew this story wasn't about vengeance or outrage. It was about the quiet power of letting someone overplay their hand. And Officer Simmons was almost there. Almost. By the afternoon recess, the courtroom felt like a coiled spring. Whispers moved through the gallery, reporters texted furiously. Social media outside the courthouse was already flooded with polarizing headlines. Some praised Officer Simmons for doing his job. Others questioned how a man like Keanu Reeves ended up in handcuffs. Inside, Keanu remained silent. When the judge returned, Benjamin asked for a brief sidebar. The conversation was quiet but intense. He requested that the court delay Keanu's testimony until they could introduce a new piece of evidence. The judge raised an eyebrow but approved, as long as relevance was established soon. Simmons watched with faint annoyance. He crossed his arms, still seated in the witness box. He believed the courtroom was tilting in his favor. He believed it because, so far, no one had pushed back. That belief was about to become his greatest mistake. The judge nodded. "Proceed with your next witness." Benjamin stood, looked around the room, then sat back down. "Your Honor, we call no witnesses at this time." Confused murmurs erupted. The judge frowned. "Very well. Officer Simmons, you may step down." As Simmons exited the stand, he glanced briefly at Keanu. Still no reaction. Then, something subtle happened. From the back of the room, a court clerk handed Benjamin a slim, sealed envelope. He opened it, removed a USB drive, and gently placed it on the table. He didn't announce it. He didn't rush to explain. He just looked at Keanu. Keanu gave him the faintest nod. Outside the courtroom, no one knew what was coming, but inside, a current shifted. Benjamin leaned into the microphone. "Your Honor, we respectfully request to introduce a piece of time-stamped footage, recently authenticated and retrieved from a nearby streetlight surveillance system. It was obtained this morning under emergency court order. It directly contradicts key elements of Officer Simmons' sworn testimony." The prosecutor stood up immediately. "Objection. This is ambush evidence. We haven't reviewed it." "It was disclosed to opposing counsel during recess," Benjamin replied calmly. The judge nodded. "Let's see it." Lights dimmed. A large monitor in the corner flickered on. The jury leaned forward. Benjamin pressed play. There it was. Keanu, alone, walking down the street, head down, phone in hand. He wasn't stumbling. He wasn't acting erratically. He wasn't reaching for anything. Then the patrol car appeared. The video had no sound, but the body language told the story. Officer Simmons exited, gestured harshly, and moved forward before Keanu could fully respond. Keanu raised his hands. Calm, submissive. Simmons grabbed him and slammed him onto the hood of the vehicle. The video froze on that frame. Silence. The prosecutor cleared his throat, but didn't speak. The judge's pen stopped mid-note. And for the first time, Simmons looked worried. Benjamin rose slowly, letting the silence linger. The jury stared at the frozen image on the screen. Keanu's hands open, his posture relaxed, the aggression coming only from the officer. Benjamin walked in front of the jury box and looked each of them in the eyes. "No yelling," he said softly, "no reaching, no resisting, just silence." He let those words settle. Silence was the only threat in that moment. And it wasn't Mr. Reeves who perceived it that way. It was the man with the badge. The prosecutor stayed still, knowing anything he said would only draw more attention to the damage done. Simmons shifted in his chair, his jaw clenched. The smug expression from earlier had vanished. His eyes darted to the door, as if looking for an exit that no longer existed. Benjamin returned to the defense table and sat beside Keanu. He didn't speak to him. He didn't need to. The courtroom had already heard what mattered. The judge cleared his throat, still visibly processing the shift. "We will resume tomorrow at 9 a.m. with the defense's continued argument and witness list." Court adjourned. The gallery rose. The reporters scribbled like mad. Flashbulbs popped just outside the hallway. But Keanu didn't rush. He stood slowly, bowed slightly to the judge, and turned to leave through the side exit. Simmons remained seated. As the room emptied, Benjamin finally turned to Keanu. "Why wait until now?" Keanu shrugged. "Because truth always lands better in silence." Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was different now. Journalists who earlier questioned why Keanu was on trial were now digging through court records. Some had already begun to speculate on Simmons's past complaints. A retired officer from the same precinct released a statement that afternoon. "This isn't the first time Simmons has escalated a calm situation." Back inside, the judge reviewed the footage a second time, alone in chambers. He paused again at the same frame, Keanu's body against the hood, peaceful, unresisting. The court staff moved through the halls quietly that evening, the weight of what they had witnessed settling in. Benjamin walked Keanu to a waiting car. No reporters followed. No one saw them leave. It was just the two of them. As they reached the car, Benjamin turned once more. "You know, tomorrow's going to be chaos." Keanu nodded. "That's okay." Benjamin hesitated. "You sure you don't want me to prep you for cross?" "I won't need it." The car door opened. Keanu stepped inside and closed it gently. Benjamin watched the car disappear into the night. He didn't know what Keanu planned next, but something told him when that courtroom reopened in the morning, no one would forget what silence had already revealed. The courtroom was still, the kind of stillness that arrives only before something irreversible. Benjamin Carter stood slowly, adjusting his glasses with a hand that trembled just enough to betray the weight of the moment. The jury had heard everything Officer Simmons claimed. They had watched him walk them through his version of the night, smooth, detailed, authoritative. But now, it was Benjamin's turn. He didn't reach for a file or approach Simmons. Instead, he pulled a small silver USB stick from his coat pocket and raised it just high enough for the judge to see. "Your Honor," Benjamin said, his voice steady and measured, "the defense requests permission to introduce video evidence relevant to the arrest in question." Judge Grayson lifted his head, adjusting his glasses with mild curiosity. Across the aisle, the prosecutor, Richard Avery, stood up quickly. "Objection. This footage wasn't listed in pretrial disclosure." "Overruled," Judge Grayson said flatly. "Let's see it." A bailiff took the USB and carried it to the media technician seated near the jury box. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the screen above the jury flickered to life. A grainy video began to play, filmed from the passenger seat of a parked car across the street from the incident. The angle was low, partially obscured by a cracked windshield and dashboard clutter, but what it captured was unmistakable. Simmons's patrol car was already parked. The headlights bathed Keanu in harsh white. He stood calmly, hands visible, shoulders relaxed. His hood was up, but not over his face. Then came Simmons's voice, loud and clipped. "Hey, what are you doing out here?" Keanu's response was calm, nearly apologetic. "I'm trying to find my hotel. I think I took a wrong turn." Simmons stepped out of the patrol car. The bystander's phone tilted slightly, trying to catch the exchange. Simmons circled Keanu, already posturing, already speaking with the tone of command. "You look nervous. Why the hoodie? Hands on the wall." Keanu didn't argue. He turned to face the wall. Then it happened. With no sudden movement from Keanu, no raised voice, no gesture that could be mistaken as hostile, Simmons grabbed him by the arm and slammed him against the patrol car hood. The metallic clang echoed through the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Someone near the back audibly whispered, "Oh my God!" The courtroom was no longer still. Keanu's voice in the video was quiet but firm. "I'm not resisting. You're hurting me." Then, a chilling line from Simmons, just loud enough to be heard on the recording. "Men like you don't get to question me." On screen, Keanu went still, his face pressed against cold metal. The cuffs clicked on. The video ended. Benjamin didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He turned toward the jury, letting the silence fill the room, letting the footage speak louder than any argument could. Officer Simmons sat frozen in the witness chair. His jaw was tight, and his arms had moved from relaxed on the armrests to folded tightly against his chest. The jury watched him now, not as the confident officer who had painted Keanu Reeves as an unpredictable threat, but as the man in the video who had slammed a peaceful person against a patrol car without provocation. Benjamin stepped forward finally, slow and steady. "Officer Simmons," he said calmly, "do you recall that interaction clearly?" Simmons cleared his throat. "I do. Do you believe that video represents the truth?" The officer hesitated. "It's taken out of context. You don't hear everything." "But we do see everything," Benjamin said, stepping closer. "We see a man following instructions. We see no erratic behavior. We see no aggression. What we see is you slamming a cooperative individual without warning." Simmons shifted in his seat. His confidence was draining fast. "That's not how it felt at the time." "And how it felt at the time," Benjamin continued, his voice low, "was enough to justify filing a police report that said Mr. Reeves was combative, that he resisted, that he reached toward your belt." Simmons didn't respond. "Would you like the jury to watch the video again?" Benjamin asked, raising the remote. "No," Simmons answered quickly. The room filled with tension. Benjamin turned back to the judge. "No further questions at this time." Judge Grayson looked down at his notes, then back up at the prosecution. "Mr. Avery?" The prosecutor stood, clearly rattled. His usual poise faltered as he adjusted his tie. "Officer Simmons, is it possible that your perception was skewed by stress?" Simmons nodded quickly, almost too eagerly. "Yes, night shifts are unpredictable. Things escalate. We're trained to act quickly. And would you say Mr. Reeves escalated the situation in any way?" Simmons blinked. He looked toward Keanu, who sat quietly with his hands folded on the table. "Not verbally, no." The courtroom held its breath. The prosecutor paused. "Thank you. No further questions." Simmons stepped down from the witness stand, but this time there was no applause from his colleagues seated in the back row. Some looked away, others whispered. Benjamin turned to Keanu, who gave a faint nod, barely perceptible but full of silent gravity. The video had changed everything. Not just the jury's understanding, but the temperature of the room. The weight of the lie had shifted, and now it sat squarely on Simmons's shoulders. For the first time since the trial began, Benjamin allowed himself a breath of hope. But he knew better than to celebrate too early. The truth had only just begun to unfold, and there was more to reveal. After the break, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. Jurors leaned in now when Benjamin spoke. The gallery, once filled with quiet skepticism, now buzzed with subdued attention. The judge looked more alert. The weight of the evidence had begun to settle in. Benjamin walked back to the center of the courtroom, a small flash drive still in his hand. "Your Honor," he said, "with the court's permission, I'd like to play one more segment of the video. Just 30 seconds more." Judge Grayson gave a slight nod. "Proceed." The video resumed on the screen. This portion had no sound. It showed Keanu calmly holding his phone out, showing something to Simmons. Then, without provocation or hesitation, Simmons shoved him against the patrol car and cuffed him. Keanu never raised his hands, never turned away, never even tensed. The room went still. Benjamin let the silence linger. Then he turned to the jury. "This is not about fame or celebrity. This is about the truth. A man was arrested because of how he looked, not because of what he did. And now you've seen that for yourselves." One juror, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, nodded slowly. Benjamin turned toward the defense table and sat down next to Keanu. "You ready?" he whispered. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He simply looked forward, his expression unchanged. Then came a subtle nod. Just one. The prosecution team whispered among themselves. They had expected an easy win, a quick trial, a fast conviction, maybe even a settlement behind closed doors. But now, the narrative was no longer in their hands. Judge Grayson cleared his throat. "We'll adjourn until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Both sides, be prepared to proceed with closing statements." The gavel came down. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled to update headlines. Stories that once read, "Keanu Reeves arrested for resisting police," were quickly replaced with words like, "Video emerges," and "Case may collapse." Inside, Keanu walked past the press without a word. Benjamin followed, gripping his notes tightly, the flash drive tucked in his pocket like a sliver of justice. He had learned something in those moments. Truth doesn't shout. It waits, and when revealed at the right moment, it speaks louder than any accusation. The tide had turned, but the real reckoning had only just begun. Simmons adjusted his collar as he sat back down on the witness stand, visibly less confident than before. The once assured grin was gone. His shoulders, which had squared up just minutes earlier, now slouched slightly under the weight of a truth not yet fully exposed. Benjamin stood at the defense table, calm, collected, and careful not to gloat. The courtroom sensed something had shifted. The video had done damage, but it was Benjamin's next move that would start to unravel the entire illusion. He walked slowly to the center of the room, a small file folder in hand. Inside were documents he had spent nights digging through. Complaints buried deep, long before Keanu's case ever emerged. He raised the folder and looked directly at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "you've just seen what one phone clip can reveal. But what about the clips we never see?" He paused, then continued. "Officer Simmons has been involved in 5 separate incidents over the past 7 years that all began the same way: suspicion without cause, aggression without justification, and ended with missing or corrupted body cam footage." The air thickened. Whispers traveled like waves across the benches. Simmons blinked slowly, as though trying to hide the sudden dryness in his eyes. Benjamin laid the documents on the evidence table and pointed to the first one. "This is the case of Thomas Leland, a 63-year-old jazz musician detained for acting erratic outside his own home. Body cam footage? Missing." He moved to the second file. "Maya Holt, single mother, pulled over for a taillight, detained for verbal aggression. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. No footage preserved." One by one, the names came out. Faces, patterns, dates, and the same signature at the bottom of each report: Officer R. Simmons. The courtroom remained silent, but the silence was loud. Even the prosecutor stopped taking notes. Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly in her seat, brow furrowed. She didn't interrupt, but her eyes narrowed at Simmons, who was now shifting uncomfortably in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. Benjamin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Truth was doing the shouting for him. "What we're seeing," Benjamin continued, "is not an isolated misunderstanding. It's a thread in a larger pattern. My client did not resist arrest. My client did not threaten Officer Simmons. My client simply walked down the street, quiet, tired, and wearing the wrong hoodie." At that moment, a murmur ran through the back of the gallery. No one interrupted, but the atmosphere had completely transformed. Keanu, still seated quietly at the defense table, didn't move. He hadn't said a word. He didn't have to. The court was starting to listen for the silence between the noise. Benjamin returned to his seat slowly, giving the jury time to absorb what they had just heard. Every movement was deliberate, not theatrical, measured, not forced. He looked over at Keanu, who gave him a small nod, calm and unreadable. The courtroom felt frozen in time, as if even the air had stopped moving. Judge Reynolds broke the silence. Her tone was crisp, professional, but tinged with curiosity. Prosecution may respond. The lead prosecutor, a man named Douglas Kern, stood with a tight jaw. He tried to recenter the courtroom by shifting focus back to the arrest itself. Your Honor, while the defense has brought up unrelated internal affairs, let us not forget that we are here for one incident, one night, one moment. The defense has no full footage of that moment, and the officer's body camera, while regrettably disconnected, cannot be assumed to have captured anything contrary to Officer Simmons's sworn testimony. It was a careful deflection, but the jury wasn't buying it as quickly now. Kern noticed the shift in their eyes. Even the most stoic juror was leaning slightly forward. Benjamin rose again, his expression patient. May I respond? The judge nodded. To the respect, he said, turning to the jury, patterns matter. If you were asked to judge a painting, would you look at only one corner of the canvas? Or would you step back to see what the strokes reveal across the whole frame? He tapped the stack of files again. These are not just names on paper. These are people who, like my client, found themselves accused without a voice, punished without proof. It is no longer just about what happened that night. It's about why Officer Simmons's credibility now stands on a house of sand. Simmons finally broke. This is all irrelevant, he muttered under his breath. The judge caught it. Excuse me, Officer Simmons? He straightened up quickly. I just mean, Your Honor, these cases were reviewed. They didn't lead to anything. They were closed. Benjamin stepped forward once more. Closed, yes, because the footage disappeared. The same way it disappeared in this case. That landed. A ripple moved through the jury box. Even the stenographer paused before catching back up. Benjamin sat down. From the bench, Judge Reynolds looked toward Simmons. Officer, I will remind you to maintain your decorum. Yes, Your Honor. But his voice had lost its steel. His words no longer carried weight. His confidence, the armor he wore in every arrest report, every courtroom appearance, had begun to crack. And everyone could see it. The courtroom reconvened after a short recess. Officer Simmons now looked markedly different. His once rigid posture had softened. His eyes, once darting confidently around the room, now stayed low, fixed on the polished surface of the witness stand, as if trying to hide behind the reflection. Benjamin stood again, holding a simple manila folder. No theatrics, just quiet certainty. Your Honor, he began, with permission, I'd like to submit a final exhibit. The judge gave a measured nod. Proceed. Benjamin opened the folder and revealed a copy of a signed statement. This is a deposition from Officer Tasha Myers, a retired officer who served alongside Simmons for 5 years. She wasn't allowed to testify during the earlier investigations, but she has since come forward under oath, stating that Officer Simmons often disabled his body camera before making arrests he believed would cause trouble later. Her words, gasps, again. The prosecutor jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial. Overruled, the judge said immediately. The court will allow the document into evidence. Benjamin stepped closer to the jury box, placing the folder gently on the rail. I ask you to think carefully. If this were a movie, it would be easy to root for the uniformed officer over the man in the hoodie. But this isn't a movie, and Mr. Reeves isn't asking for applause. He's asking for truth. He walked away and sat down. His job was done, for now. The courtroom shifted again, slowly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't just the jury anymore, even the gallery. A mix of curious onlookers and whispering reporters began to sense what had been unfolding wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the quiet, buried patterns that live beneath the surface of institutions. Patterns no one wants to admit still exist. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. Officer Simmons, do you have any rebuttal to this sworn statement? Simmons shook his head slowly. I don't recall that incident, he said, his voice faint. Which incident? She asked. Simmons blinked. Any of them. A hollow answer. Benjamin didn't even need to respond. In the silence that followed, Keanu finally looked up, not to gloat, not to speak, just to acknowledge the room. His gaze moved from juror to juror, soft and level, the kind of look that didn't demand anything but invited reflection. And one by one they returned the gaze, not because he was famous, but because for the first time since the trial began, they saw him not as a symbol or a stranger, but as a man who had simply told the truth without raising his voice. The courtroom settled into a stillness that felt more like a held breath than a pause. All eyes turned to the witness stand as Keanu Reeves rose. He adjusted the collar of his simple black shirt and walked forward with quiet composure. There were no theatrics, no crowd-pleasing gestures, just the slow and steady steps of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to clarify. When he took the stand, even the reporters shifted forward, as if sensing this moment would be different from the rest. Keanu sat, placed his hands gently on the edge of the witness box, and looked straight ahead. Benjamin stood up, voice calm. "Mr. Reeves, would you kindly tell the court what happened the night you were arrested?" Keanu didn't blink. He didn't glance around for support. He simply started. "I had just finished filming a scene. It was late. I was trying to get back to the hotel. I stopped on a quiet street to check my map. That's when the patrol car arrived." His tone was steady. No anger, no self-pity, just truth, pure, undistilled. "Did you say anything threatening?" Benjamin asked. "Did you resist?" "What was going through your mind when Officer Simmons pushed you against the hood of his vehicle?" Keanu paused. The courtroom leaned in. "I was thinking how quickly dignity can be taken from someone who stays silent." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor stood, trying to pivot. "Mr. Reeves, were you aware that your appearance, hooded sweatshirt, unshaven, walking alone, might have looked suspicious to an officer late at night?" Keanu turned to him, calm as ever. "I was aware I looked like someone who might not be recognized." That answer hit harder than a protest. Benjamin stepped forward again. "One last thing, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'd like to submit this." He held up a thick folder and walked toward the judge's bench. "This document contains Mr. Reeves' full profile, not as a celebrity, but as a citizen." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." Benjamin handed it over. Contained inside is evidence that Mr. Reeves has donated over $2 million to criminal justice reform programs in the last 5 years. He has helped fund police de-escalation training. He's worked with civil rights organizations to revise procedural conduct, and he serves as an informal advisor on ethics training for multiple departments across the country. Gasps filled the room. Benjamin's voice grew firmer. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this isn't just about a man being wrongly accused. This is about a man who has spent years quietly improving the very system that failed him that night." Even the judge removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes in disbelief. Officer Simmons suddenly looked very small in his seat, very human, very exposed. A silence stretched across the courtroom as the judge flipped through the pages of the folder. Each document confirmed what Benjamin had just said. Donation receipts, partnership agreements with civil rights groups, letters of recommendation from precinct captains who had attended Keanu's anonymously funded ethics workshops. This wasn't performance. This was a paper trail of principle. The jury leaned in now, not with judgment, but with recognition. Something had shifted. The man on the stand was no longer a defendant in their eyes. He was something else entirely. Benjamin turned back to Keanu. "Why didn't you mention any of this earlier?" Keanu's voice was soft. "Because character should speak for itself." The words hung in the air. Simple, devastating. The prosecutor stood again, more cautious this time. "Mr. Reeves, these initiatives, were they publicized?" "No," Keanu said plainly. "They weren't meant to be." But you understand that remaining silent during an investigation can make you look evasive. I wasn't being evasive, I was being careful. Some things once said become about ego. I didn't want that. A few members of the jury nodded unconsciously. Benjamin returned to the podium. Let's return to the night in question. Did you at any point make a threat, reach for the officer's weapon, or resist arrest? No. And were you aware at the time that your rights were being violated? I was. Then why didn't you fight back? Keanu looked up, eyes steady. Because fighting back would have proved his story. Sometimes the only way to hold on to your truth is to live it, not shout it. The room fell so silent you could hear someone shift in their seat. Benjamin stepped to the side and let the weight of Keanu's words settle. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, I assume you'll be making closing statements soon? Benjamin nodded. Yes, Your Honor. But before we do, I'd like to call attention to one last thing. He turned to the screen at the side of the courtroom. A new video clip played. It was short, barely 30 seconds. But it showed Simmons, standing over Keanu that night, muttering something under his breath. The audio was faint, but enhanced enough to hear. Think you're special? You're nobody in this town. The jury turned sharply. The implication was undeniable. This wasn't about suspicion. This was about power, abuse of it, and envy. Simmons visibly sank lower in his seat. Benjamin addressed the jury. You've seen the tape. You've read the files. You've heard both men speak. The question is no longer what happened. It's why it happened. He sat down, and the courtroom remained suspended in that question, hanging in the air like a final chord waiting for resolution. The jury was excused for a brief recess before closing arguments, but no one left their seats. People whispered quietly, many glancing back at Keanu, no longer as a defendant, but as a man who had chosen silence over spectacle, restraint over revenge. Officer Simmons remained seated, his posture crouching with every tick of the clock. His once confident smirk was gone. The man who had strutted into the courtroom days earlier now looked like a shell of that image. Drenched in sweat, his collar loose, fingers nervously tapping the bench. Benjamin leaned over to Keanu. Are you ready for closing arguments? Keanu gave a slight nod. Just speak the truth. That's always enough. When the jury returned, Benjamin stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or perform. He simply told a story. A man walked alone at night after a long day of work. He wore a hoodie. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He didn't threaten anyone, and for that, he was slammed against a car, cuffed, and thrown into a cell. Because someone believed the worst without knowing the first thing about him. He paused, looking directly at each juror. You've seen who this man really is. You've seen how calmly he handled what most would have exploded over, and now you know why. Because this man has been fighting for justice long before he ever had to sit in this courtroom. Benjamin closed the folder and took one last look at Keanu. People say you can tell who someone is by how they treat those with no power, but you can also tell who they are by how they act when they have the power, and choose not to use it. That's what makes someone rare. That's what makes someone good. He sat down. The prosecutor's rebuttal was short and subdued. They knew the tide had turned. Simmons's earlier confidence now worked against him. His smirks, his exaggerated testimony, his missing body cam footage. It was all unraveling. Keanu didn't react. He simply sat with his hands folded, head bowed slightly, as if waiting not for justice, but for closure. When the judge dismissed the court for deliberation, murmurs began again. The gallery buzzed. Reporters typed frantically, but Keanu just stood and walked to the window, looking out in silence. In the hallway outside, Simmons slumped against a wall. A junior officer passed him without a word. The hierarchy that once protected him was beginning to fade. It wasn't just about Keanu anymore. It was about a pattern, a culture, and it had finally been cracked open in front of the entire world. What the jury would do next remained to be seen. But the truth had already stepped into the light, and it wasn't going back. The courtroom had fallen silent. No camera flashes, no murmurs. Just the quiet weight of anticipation as Keanu Reeves stepped forward, turned, and addressed the jury directly. He didn't walk to the podium with swagger or flourish. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though each step carried the burden of far more than his own story. "I didn't want to be recognized," Keanu began, his voice low, steady. "That's not what this is about. I didn't stay silent because I had something to hide. I stayed silent because I wanted to see what would happen when I was treated like anybody else." The jury shifted, eyes locked onto him. No screens, no filters, just a man speaking from experience. "When the arrest happened," he continued, "I didn't resist. I didn't speak up, not because I was guilty, but because I knew others don't get the benefit of doubt. Others don't have the luxury of their name being a shield." He looked directly at an older juror, then to a young black man near the back. Not with pity, but with truth. "I wanted to walk through the same fire so many others walk through every day," Keanu said. "Because how justice treats the unknown is how it should treat us all." Benjamin, sitting just behind him, didn't move. His legal pads remained untouched. This moment wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about truth. "I've had people assume I'm someone because of movies I've done or headlines they've read, but I'm not here as that person. I'm here as someone who believes that dignity shouldn't depend on fame." A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Another juror blinked hard, as though trying to process the simplicity of it all. Keanu wasn't demanding outrage. He was offering a mirror. "I'm not the victim," he said. "Not really. I got out. I have a voice. But there are thousands, maybe millions, who don't." He paused. The room leaned in. "This courtroom is not just about me. It's about what happens when power goes unchecked, when stories go untold, when silence is mistaken for guilt and calmness is confused for threat." Even the judge was still now. No pen tapping, no adjusting of glasses, just stillness. "I don't want revenge," Keanu said. "I want recognition. Not of who I am, but of what this says about how we treat each other when we think no one is watching." He nodded slightly and stepped back. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't theatrical. It was human. The impact was felt before anyone spoke. The jurors didn't look at their notes. They looked at one another. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, as if the ground had moved beneath her. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a reflection. Benjamin stood slowly, not to dramatize the moment, but to let it breathe. He didn't need to embellish what had just been said. Instead, he walked over to the evidence table and picked up a single sheet of paper. Then he looked at the jury. "We often ask ourselves," Benjamin began, "how someone like Officer Simmons ends up in a courtroom being challenged. We wonder, how does it go that far?" He held the paper up. "This is a letter from a man who was arrested in the same city last year. Same charge. No celebrity, no video. He spent 14 days in jail before the charges were dropped, and no one apologized." Benjamin placed the letter back on the table and turned toward Keanu. "Mr. Reeves didn't come here today to escape consequences. He came to remind us what happens when truth waits too long." He paused again. "Maybe you believe this is a misunderstanding. Maybe you believe Officer Simmons misread the situation. That's fair. But now, you've seen the video, you've heard the truth, and you've seen who this man really is, not as a star, but as a citizen." The jury listened, but more than that, they seemed to understand. Keanu had not used his platform to demand privilege. He had used it to expose a pattern. The fact that he had waited this long to reveal who he was made it clear he wanted no special treatment. Simmons, who had been so bold earlier in the week, now sat with his head slightly tilted down, jaw tight. He hadn't said a word since Keanu testified. It was as if the power dynamic had reversed, and not because of celebrity, but because of truth. The judge finally broke the silence. "Mr. Carter," he said to Benjamin, "do you have anything else to present?" Benjamin shook his head. "No, Your Honor, the defense rests." The prosecutor stood up, uncertain, her notes seeming smaller than before. She looked at the jury, then back at Simmons, but no words came. She finally said, "The state will proceed to closing arguments tomorrow." The gavel tapped once, and the room began to clear. Jurors shuffled out, slower than usual. Reporters typed rapidly at their laptops. And Keanu? He simply nodded to Benjamin and stepped down, calm as ever. As the courtroom emptied, a woman approached Benjamin. "Is he really who he says he is?" she asked. Benjamin looked over his shoulder at Keanu, who was already walking quietly out the side exit. "No," he said. "He's more than that." And with that, Section 8 moved from courtroom testimony to something deeper. It wasn't just about clearing a name. It was about questioning a system. And the questions had only just begun. The next morning, the jury returned to the courtroom early. There was a quietness in the air that hadn't been there before. Not the quiet of boredom or routine, but reflection. The kind that comes after something inside you shifts. Keanu arrived the same way he always had, understated. Still no entourage, still in a black suit that had probably seen better days, still nodding politely to the security staff at the door, and still completely calm. Benjamin sat beside him, flipping through his notes. But he wasn't preparing, he was reading. Letters, dozens of them. Messages sent to the court overnight after Keanu's testimony had gone viral. Letters from veterans, teachers, ex-offenders, and social workers. They all echoed the same thing. Ames spoke for me. The prosecutor entered next. This time there was no confidence in her stride, no fire in her voice. As she began her closing argument, she looked at the jury and said something unexpected. "You have every right to question what you've seen, and more importantly, what you haven't seen." But the words fell flat. It was too late for doubt. When Benjamin stood for the final time, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He didn't even speak for more than 2 minutes. This isn't a trial about Keanu Reeves. This is a trial about perception, about how fast we judge when someone doesn't look the part, about how easily silence is mistaken for guilt. You know who he is now, but more importantly, you know who he was before you did. And with that, he sat down. The judge turned to the jury. "You are now dismissed to deliberate." The jurors left the room, some with hands in pockets, others already whispering. It didn't take long. Just under an hour later, they returned. As the foreperson stood, Keanu didn't fidget. He didn't brace. He just folded his hands and looked ahead. "Through the charge of resisting arrest," the foreperson said, "we find the defendant not guilty." A quiet gasp moved through the room, but Keanu didn't flinch. He simply nodded once and exhaled, a breath he had held not for himself, but for the people who couldn't stand there and do the same. He shook Benjamin's hand and whispered, "Thank you for believing." Benjamin smiled. "Thank you for waiting." Outside, the world had changed. Cameras waited, reporters buzzed, headlines were already forming. But Keanu didn't stop for any of them. He walked down the courthouse steps slowly, passing the crowd, the flashbulbs, and the noise. And once again, he disappeared. Quietly, just like he arrived. Benjamin stood at the center of the courtroom, his hands steady, his eyes fixed on the judge. The weight of the past few days hung in the air like smoke. He cleared his throat and held up a printed report. The personnel file of Officer Simmons. The judge motioned for him to proceed. As Benjamin walked to the witness stand, he read aloud from the document, his voice calm but firm. "This is a disciplinary record from 3 years ago. A similar arrest. Suspect released without charge. Body cam footage never recovered." He let the papers settle onto the evidence table. Then he lifted another file. "And this one?" Different year, different suspect. Same pattern. Excessive force complaint. Dismissed. No video. The jury leaned forward. One woman in the back row crossed her arms, visibly tense. A man beside her raised an eyebrow and exchanged a glance with another juror. The atmosphere was shifting. Simmons, still in uniform, fidgeted slightly at the defense table. For the first time, he wasn't the most confident man in the room. Benjamin didn't stop. He placed a third file in front of the judge. All 5 of these cases include Officer Simmons, and all 5 are marked with missing footage, vague reporting, and no follow-up. The judge raised his eyebrows. He turned slowly to Simmons. The once sturdy authority figure now sat with his jaw clenched, eyes darting toward his attorney. "Officer Simmons," the judge said, "are you prepared to respond to these claims?" Simmons shifted in his seat. "Your Honor, These are unrelated. None of those cases were relevant to this incident." Benjamin raised his voice, not out of anger but clarity. "That's the point. They weren't allowed to become relevant, because no one ever asked why your body cam keeps going dark." The gallery murmured. The tension thickened. Benjamin returned to the table and picked up a new folder. This one containing letters from former officers, now retired. Each letter referenced Simmons's pattern of aggressive behavior, his tendency to escalate, his record of silence. "I don't present this to humiliate him," Benjamin continued, turning toward the jury. "I present this because patterns tell the truth when people try to hide it." Keanu sat still in his chair. He hadn't moved, hadn't blinked much, but his presence was powerful. His silence had become its own kind of protest. Measured, dignified, undeniable. Benjamin paused. "We've heard a lot about Mr. Reeves' suspicious behavior," he said. "Now you've seen what that really looked like. And now you're seeing what it might have meant to stay silent, to let it go, to do nothing." He nodded toward the judge and sat down. The courtroom was still. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward. His gaze lingered on Officer Simmons as if trying to read something deeper behind the uniform. He tapped his pen twice on the bench, then looked toward the prosecution table. "Does the state have a response to these documented patterns?" The prosecutor stood, clearly caught off guard. "Your Honor, while the defense raises some concerns, these documents are not direct evidence of misconduct in the case before us. They're historical." The judge interrupted him, his tone sharper now. "Historical patterns often reveal systemic truths. And in my courtroom, systemic truths matter." The prosecutor sat down quietly. Benjamin rose again, this time carrying a small USB drive between his fingers. He handed it to the court clerk and waited as the footage loaded on the courtroom screen. It wasn't the same bystander video from before. This was new. The clip played. Different man years earlier, face bloodied, hands behind his back, crying out that he couldn't breathe. The voice of Officer Simmons, unmistakable, yelling over him. The footage had been part of a whistleblower leak, one that had never gone public. Benjamin had obtained it with permission from a retired sergeant. When the screen went dark, no one said a word. Keanu remained composed, but his fingers curled slightly where they rested on the table. The judge looked down at his notepad, then back up again. "Officer Simmons, were you disciplined for this incident?" Simmons swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor." "Was it investigated?" "No, Your Honor, it was settled quietly." The judge nodded slowly. "That's what I feared." Gasps rippled through the gallery. One juror, a younger man in a blue jacket, blinked several times and wiped his eyes. Benjamin stood once more. His voice was steady, not accusatory. "We're not just here because of one arrest. We're here because that arrest fits into a story. A story about power, silence, and what happens when dignity is stripped from someone who refuses to fight back with rage." He turned toward the jury. "You now know who Keanu Reeves is, but the truth is that shouldn't matter. This trial isn't about celebrity. It's about character, about who we become when no one's looking, and what happens when someone decides they've had enough of being invisible. Keanu remained silent, but his silence was louder than any outburst could have been. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete you could hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. Benjamin Carter stood slowly, adjusting his jacket with a calm deliberateness that seemed to steady his own nerves. All eyes turned toward him. The young public defender who had, over the past few days, transformed from an underestimated novice into a voice of clarity and courage. He stepped to the center of the courtroom, paused, and met the gaze of each juror one by one. There was no dramatic gesture, no flashy display, just the quiet presence of someone who knew the weight of what he was about to say. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady, "I stand before you not to win a case, but to remind you of something we all know in our hearts. The law exists to protect, not to assume." He walked slowly as he spoke, not behind the podium but in front of it, as though he were speaking directly across a dinner table. Keanu Reeves did not ask for special treatment. He didn't pull rank. He didn't shout his name. He didn't resist. What he did was remain silent, because he believed that being calm and respectful would be enough. Benjamin paused, letting that settle. But what happens in a world where silence is taken as defiance, where calm is mistaken for guilt? He looked toward Officer Simmons, whose expression had hardened into a defensive mask. Then back at the jury. "You saw the footage. You saw a man standing still, cooperating, speaking respectfully, and getting slammed into a car for it. You heard a story from the officer that did not match what your own eyes confirmed. You witnessed the unraveling of a narrative designed not to protect the truth but to protect power." Benjamin opened a small folder and held up a sheet. "This," he said, "is a record of 5 other complaints against Officer Simmons. 5 stories. 5 silences, and in each case, the body cam footage went missing, every time." He let the paper fall back into the folder gently. "We often hear that justice is blind, but I don't believe that's true. Justice sees. It sees character, it sees motive, and today, it sees you. Because now, it's your turn to see clearly." Benjamin's voice softened. "You've heard from people who know Keanu Reeves personally, people who have no reason to lie. You've heard how he has donated to reform systems that would have benefited him if he were dishonest, but he never used that influence for personal gain, not once." He turned toward Keanu, who sat quietly at the table, hands folded, gaze calm. Hoog could have walked away from this, called someone, made it disappear, but he didn't. He stood in this courtroom not just for himself, but for everyone who doesn't get to be heard. He chose to let the truth speak louder than his name. Benjamin looked back at the jury one final time. "And now, I ask you to let your verdict do the same." The jury sat still, unmoving, yet visibly affected. Some leaned forward, others sat straighter in their chairs, but all of them carried the same look in their eyes, like something had shifted. Something heavy had landed. It wasn't just about an arrest anymore. It was about a pattern, a silence, a system. Benjamin quietly returned to his seat. He didn't look triumphant. He looked reflective, almost burdened, as though even the victory he was hoping for could never fully undo what had been done. The judge cleared his throat, giving instructions to the jury. Legal protocols, reminders of their responsibility, a final note to decide solely based on the evidence presented. And then they were led out, one by one, into the deliberation room. Inside the courtroom, time slowed. The air felt still, thick with unspoken tension. Keanu remained seated, calm, his fingers interlocked. He didn't glance at Simmons. He didn't look around the room. He simply stared ahead, almost as if he were meditating. For him, this wasn't about winning. It was about revealing. And what had been revealed could not be hidden again. Across the aisle, Officer Simmons shifted in his seat. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Simmons didn't react. His jaw clenched, his hands fidgeted. The mask was gone, replaced by something raw, unease, maybe even regret. But it was too late now. The press sat silently in the back row, scribbling notes, watching every twitch of every face. The headlines were already forming, but what mattered wasn't the headlines. It was the truth, and for once, it was being heard. Outside the courtroom, the world buzzed. Protesters and supporters stood on opposite sides of the courthouse steps. Some held signs reading, "Justice for all." Others waved banners with Keanu's face now transformed into a symbol of restraint and dignity. News vans lined the curb. Reporters gave hourly updates, speculating on the jury's decision, recycling footage of the arrest and the courtroom revelations. But inside, away from the noise, the truth sat quietly, waiting. After nearly 2 hours, the jury returned. 12 men and women filed in, faces solemn. No one looked confident. No one looked relaxed. They sat, hands folded, waiting for the clerk. The judge asked the question, "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." A beat of silence. Then, on the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant, Keanu Reeves, not guilty. A sharp exhale filled the courtroom. Keanu didn't move. Not a blink, not a shift in posture, just a small, nearly imperceptible breath. The foreman continued, "On the charge of disorderly conduct, we find the defendant not guilty." Another wave of relief rolled through the room. Benjamin lowered his head, then looked to Keanu, who nodded once in silent thanks. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. Then, looking over his glasses, he addressed the courtroom with something unscripted. "There are moments when a courtroom becomes more than a place of judgment," he said. "It becomes a mirror." Today was one of those moments. And with that, the gavel fell. The courtroom had never been so silent. It was the kind of silence that made your heart louder than your thoughts. Keanu Reeves sat still, his posture upright, his expression calm yet unreadable. His hoodie was gone, replaced by a simple black blazer over a white shirt. No designer logos, no flashy tie, just a man waiting for truth to speak louder than noise. Across the aisle, Officer Simmons looked down at the table in front of him. His fingers were laced together, knuckles white, jaw tense. For the first time, his confidence was gone. Gone were the rehearsed lines and puffed-up chest. In its place was a man stripped of certainty. The judge returned to the bench with a nod. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. A woman in her 40s, the jury forewoman, stood. Her voice was strong but not theatrical. "We have, Your Honor." A bailiff stepped forward, accepting the folded sheet of paper. It traveled from hand to hand, arriving in front of the judge. He read it quietly first, then looked up. His eyes found Keanu's. Then, slowly, he nodded. "In the matter of the state versus Keanu Charles Reeves," the judge announced, "on the charge of resisting arrest, not guilty." A hush fell before the storm. On the charge of obstruction, not guilty. The silence cracked. A murmur grew. And then, like the rush of water over a dam, applause erupted in the gallery. Benjamin Carter didn't smile. Not yet. He turned to Keanu. The actor didn't move. No sigh of relief, no raised eyebrow, just the same quiet dignity that had carried him through every moment of this nightmare. But the forewoman wasn't finished. She cleared her throat. The judge motioned for silence. The room obeyed. "Your Honor," she said, holding up another paper, "the jury respectfully submits a recommendation. We urge this court to initiate an immediate investigation into Officer Simmons' pattern of misconduct, including the 5 prior complaints documented by the defense." Gasps, audible, sharp, and full of shock. Simmons' face drained of color. He looked at his attorney. She was frozen. He looked at the judge. No rescue was coming. The judge leaned forward. This court accepts the jury's recommendation and will formally request the Internal Affairs Division to open an inquiry into Officer Simmons's conduct, effective immediately. Simmons leaned back in his chair, mouth open. Not a word came out. His body deflated, like air hissing from a worn-out tire. Benjamin finally exhaled, slowly, with reverence. He turned to Keanu again. This time, Keanu nodded once. The media outside the courthouse didn't know what had just happened. But inside, the mood had transformed. The weight that had quietly grown through every false accusation, every misjudged silence, every smear in the headlines, it had shifted, lifted. Not because someone shouted louder, but because someone chose not to. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. Court is adjourned. Keanu stood up slowly. Benjamin stood with him. They didn't embrace. No dramatic handshakes. Just a shared look of understanding between two men who had weathered something vast and deeply personal. Reporters waited outside, cameras already rolling, microphones shoved forward. Flashes popped like lightning against a blue sky. But Keanu didn't head toward them. He didn't lift his hand or make a statement. Instead, he walked past them all, calm, composed, and silent. Benjamin followed closely. They reached the curb. Keanu paused and looked down at the pavement. For a second, it seemed like he might say something. Then he simply turned to Benjamin and offered a quiet, "Thank you." Benjamin's voice cracked slightly. "I should be thanking you." Across the street, a woman stood holding her phone. She hadn't come for a headline. She had come because she remembered the video. She remembered the silence. And she remembered the dignity. She didn't shout his name. She simply placed her hand over her heart and nodded. Keanu nodded back. Back inside the courtroom, Simmons remained seated. Alone. The gallery had emptied. His lawyer sat with her arms folded, motionless. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. No badge, no weapon, just a pen. He clicked it once, then stared at it like he no longer knew what it meant. For the first time, he looked like a man stripped of uniform, reputation, and story. And Keanu, far from the noise and the cameras, stepped into a quiet black car. The door closed with a soft thud. The city moved on. But something in it had changed. Not just the outcome of a trial, but the reminder it gave that truth doesn't need to shout. That dignity, even under pressure, can win. And that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that never needed to raise itself. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse opened with a slow groan. Keanu stepped into the daylight, blinking under the swarm of flashbulbs and the hum of murmuring voices. Dozens of reporters had gathered outside, some holding microphones, others with cameras raised, hoping for a statement, a soundbite, anything. But Keanu didn't flinch. He walked forward, steady and calm, as if the chaos around him didn't exist. He paused on the courthouse steps. The crowd quieted almost instantly. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't deliver a speech rehearsed for headlines. He simply looked into the sea of lenses and said, "This wasn't about me. It was about everyone who doesn't get the chance to be heard." For a moment, it felt like the world stopped. His words weren't loud, but they carried. They cut through the noise, the speculation, the scandal, and landed squarely on the heart of the issue. Keanu turned, nodding once to Benjamin Carter, who stood a few steps behind him. Then he descended the steps without another word. Reporters began shouting questions, but Keanu kept walking. He passed the microphones. He passed the cameras. He passed the temptation to become the center of the story. The people who knew him weren't surprised. This wasn't new. This was just who he was. Inside the courthouse, a quiet discussion began among reporters. Some had covered celebrity trials for years, but something about this felt different. There was no anger, no spectacle, just a man pointing to something bigger than himself. Meanwhile, Benjamin Carter was still on the steps, overwhelmed. The young public defender had barely slept in days, but the adrenaline kept him upright. A reporter asked for his comment. He smiled, tired but proud, and said, "Keanu never asked me to prove he was famous. He only asked me to prove he was innocent." Hours later, the clip of Keanu's brief statement began circulating online. It spread like fire, not because of scandal, but because of sincerity. Headlines ran everywhere. Keanu breaks his silence with one sentence that's now a movement. The video showed Keanu standing alone on the steps, refusing to blame, refusing to gloat, and that clip was shared by everyday people, lawyers, activists, teachers, even police officers. In the midst of the flood of reactions, one thing became clear. This wasn't about clearing a celebrity's name. It was about shedding light on the hundreds, even thousands of men and women who had no cameras to protect them, no celebrity status to vindicate them, no voice loud enough to break through the system's silence. Keanu's silence had spoken louder than outrage ever could. The press kept calling. Major news networks offered prime-time interviews. Publishers reached out with book deals. Documentary crews asked for exclusives. But each request was politely declined. Keanu didn't want the story to become about him. He believed that if the spotlight stayed too long on one person, it might blind others to the real problem. Instead, Keanu made a quiet exit from Los Angeles. He returned to his modest home, far from the cameras, interviews, and noise. While the country debated what had happened, while hashtags trended and op-eds were written, he was at a children's hospital, reading books to kids in recovery rooms. There were no reporters there, no press releases, just quiet conversations, silly voices, and soft laughter that filled sterile halls with warmth. Benjamin, however, found himself thrust unexpectedly into the spotlight. Offers came his way too. A major law firm wanted to recruit him, and advocacy groups asked him to speak about the trial. But he remembered what Keanu had told him the night before the verdict. "You're not here to win, you're here to serve. Let that be enough." So Benjamin turned down the law firm offer. He chose instead to stay at the public defender's office. In a short time, he became one of the leading voices on justice reform in his district. He wrote op-eds, mentored new attorneys, and quietly changed the way the city treated its most vulnerable defendants. He often said that his greatest teacher hadn't been in a law school lecture, but in a silent man in a holding cell. Meanwhile, the national conversation kept growing. Colleges held panels. Legal blogs began tracing the patterns of false arrests, misuse of body cameras, and the weight of assumptions in courtrooms. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about a system that needed eyes on it. 1 week after the verdict, Keanu's short courtroom testimony was shared during a congressional hearing on police accountability. His quote, "The law should not depend on what name you carry, but on the truth you carry," was printed on posters, shared on social media, and even printed on t-shirts worn by young law students around the country. Yet Keanu said nothing more. He didn't do follow-ups, he didn't tweet or post, he didn't join the panels or accept the praise. He simply returned to his work, to his life, to the quiet service that had always meant more to him than any headline ever could. A documentary was made later that year titled The Quiet Case. It featured Benjamin, character witnesses, and legal experts, but not Keanu. When asked why he declined to appear, Keanu responded with a single sentence typed in a letter. It was never about the man, it was always about the mirror. That letter was read aloud during the film's premiere. The room fell silent. Justice, people realized, didn't always begin with a bang. Sometimes it began with silence, with humility, with someone refusing to make their pain louder than someone else's. Sometimes it began with a man in a hoodie, wrongfully accused, quietly courageous, and deeply unwilling to let it be about him. Keanu's name would fade from the headlines in the weeks that followed. But the story, the truth behind it, would not. It had already taken root in hearts, in policy rooms, in young minds just beginning to question what fairness really looks like. And that, Keanu believed, was enough. The verdict had barely finished echoing through the courtroom when the first ripples began. Within 24 hours, the State Ethics Committee announced it was launching a comprehensive audit into Officer Simmons's prior arrests. What started as a quiet internal review quickly expanded into a formal investigation, stretching back over a decade. Documents surfaced. Complaints that had once been marked as resolved were re-examined under a new lens. Body cam footage that had conveniently gone missing in several cases became a red flag in every file. What once had been dismissed as coincidence was now seen as a pattern. Disturbing, systemic, and undeniable. By the end of the week, the committee had flagged 9 questionable arrests made by Simmons. Each one involved young men, mostly from marginalized communities. In 3 of those cases, the charges were suspiciously similar to what Keanu had experienced: resisting arrest, acting suspicious, failure to comply. One particular file stood out. A man named Dante Ramirez had served 6 months in jail for a crime he didn't commit. At the time, Dante had insisted he had been cooperative, but no one had believed him. His public defender had been overworked and underfunded, and the court had taken Simmons's word as gospel. But now, with the committee digging deeper and new evidence surfacing, Dante's case was reopened. When the news reached Dante, he was stunned. He had already lost his job, missed the birth of his daughter, and spent half a year trying to rebuild his life with a permanent stain on his record. The idea that someone as famous as Keanu Reeves had been arrested by the same officer under the same pretenses felt surreal. For the first time, Dante had a chance to be heard. His voice, once buried beneath assumptions and legal red tape, was suddenly amplified. Media outlets reached out, advocacy groups offered legal support, and within a matter of weeks, the charges against him were overturned. He was publicly exonerated. The judge who read the decision even apologized, something Dante never thought he'd hear in his lifetime. Meanwhile, the police department faced mounting public pressure. The trial had done more than expose one man's misconduct. It had peeled back layers of systemic failure. In response, the department's leadership convened an emergency task force. They called it Project Reset, and its mission was simple: reform. Officers were required to attend new training protocols focused on ethics, de-escalation, and unconscious bias. A new position was created for a civilian oversight coordinator, someone independent of the department, empowered to investigate future misconduct without interference. And still, through it all, Keanu remained silent. He declined every interview. He turned down television specials, morning shows, and documentaries. He refused book deals, magazine covers, and exclusive exposés. Instead, he visited a small community center in East LA, unannounced and unaccompanied. There he met with families whose sons had experienced the same quiet injustice. Some wept when they saw him. Others shook his hand, their eyes filled with unspoken thanks. Keanu didn't stay long. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words were simple. No one should need a name to be treated with dignity. The impact of the trial was not limited to law enforcement or the courtroom. It reached schools, churches, barbershops, and neighborhood meetings. Young people who had grown used to hearing that their voices didn't matter saw something different for once. A quiet man who didn't fight with fists or rage, but with patience, truth, and dignity. Teachers began showing clips of Benjamin Carter's closing argument in civics classes. Community leaders quoted Keanu's single sentence outside the courthouse: "This wasn't about me. It was about everyone who doesn't get the chance to be heard." But even as the world talked, Keanu remained almost invisible. His team released no public statements, no social media posts, no film studio promotion, no agents, no press tours. It confused many in Hollywood, who would have seen this as the perfect platform to pivot, to capitalize, to speak louder. But Keanu's choice was deliberate. He believed the moment should belong to those whose names had never made the news. One day, without cameras or attention, Keanu attended a small gathering at a shelter for formerly incarcerated men. Among them was Dante Ramirez, now a free man. They spoke quietly in the corner of the room, away from the crowd. Dante thanked him not for the fame or the exposure, but for the reminder that truth always matters, even when the world looks away. Keanu smiled and said, "You deserved justice before I ever walked into that courtroom." At the same time, Benjamin Carter found himself in a new position too. He was approached by multiple law firms and advocacy organizations, but he turned most of them down. Instead, he began developing a non-profit to offer legal aid to people who couldn't afford high-power attorneys. He named it The Quiet Stand. Its mission was simple: to protect the overlooked, to give voice to people who didn't have a stage. And while Keanu never officially joined the organization, his influence ran through every part of it, from the design of the website to the anonymous donation that covered their first year of operating costs. One afternoon, a reporter asked Benjamin if Keanu had changed his life. He paused before answering, "No. He reminded me of who I wanted to be." There's a difference. Back at the police department, reforms continued. Officer Simmons was officially suspended without pay pending further review. Whistleblowers came forward sharing internal emails that had been ignored for years. In response, the department established an anonymous reporting system and opened an office for third-party review. Some officers grumbled at the changes, calling it overreaction. But most, especially the younger ones, understood. They saw the tide turning and knew that silence was no longer an option. As the city slowly adjusted to its new reality, something remarkable began to happen. People started talking. Really talking. Not in anger, not in outrage, but in clarity. Neighbors discussed policies. Students debated ethics. Churches hosted forums. And in all of it, the name Keanu Reeves rarely came up. Not because people forgot him, but because the story had become bigger than him. In the end, that's what he wanted. Legacy, he once said, isn't about what people say when you're gone. It's about what changes because you showed up. And in this city, justice had finally started whispering through the streets. Not in celebrity, but in change. Benjamin Carter sat at the edge of his desk, a worn leather briefcase beside him and a stack of public defender case files at his feet. Outside his office window, the afternoon sun lit the rooftops of the city where he had once walked into courtrooms unnoticed. But now, everything had changed. The Keanu Reeves case had done more than shift a narrative. It had transformed a man. Benjamin wasn't the same cautious, soft-spoken attorney who had once second-guessed every objection. He had stepped into that courtroom as a helper. He left it as something else. After the verdict, calls began flooding in from major law firms. Some offered salaries 10 times what he made. Others dangled high-profile cases, TV interviews, even book deals. But Benjamin declined them all. One call, however, he didn't ignore. It was from a mother in a nearby district. Her son arrested under suspicious circumstances by the same police unit formerly overseen by Simmons. Her voice shook with fear, not because she didn't believe in the law, but because she no longer trusted it would work for people like her son. Benjamin drove there the next day. He sat with the boy in a cramped interview room, flickering lights, peeling paint. The teenager barely made eye contact. But Benjamin recognized the silence. It was the same silence Keanu had worn in court. The same misunderstood quiet that people called defiance when it was really just fear and restraint. Benjamin told the young man about the case, not with name-dropping or drama, but with truth. "You don't have to shout to be heard," he said gently. "Sometimes stillness speaks loudest." The boy lifted his head. And just like that, Benjamin knew where he belonged. He wasn't meant for glossy boardrooms or televised panels. His place was here, in the spaces where voices still trembled, and justice wasn't a guarantee. He returned to his office, met with his supervisor, and confirmed what he already felt in his bones. He was staying in public defense, but he wasn't staying small. He drafted new internal policies for defender teams, emphasizing trauma-informed questioning, community engagement, and open-door policies for clients' families. He started mentoring junior defenders who, like him once, carried more fear than confidence into the courtroom. One afternoon, a journalist cornered him outside court. "You're turning down national cases. Why?" Benjamin smiled. "Because justice isn't a performance, it's a responsibility." The article ran the next day with the headline, "The Lawyer Who Stayed." But even then, he said very little about Keanu. In the one formal interview he agreed to, Benjamin spoke carefully. No theatrics, no sound bites. "My client didn't just win his case," he said. "He changed mine." And then, almost as an afterthought, he added something else. "I used to think my job was to argue, but what he showed me was that real advocacy isn't loud. It's steady. It's rooted in conviction." The reporter asked if they still spoke. Benjamin chuckled softly. "Not much. But I don't need to. Some people leave their words behind without ever needing to repeat them." Weeks later, Benjamin received a handwritten envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper. The handwriting was unmistakably neat, almost artistic in its precision. He read, "You defended a man without knowing his weight in the world. That's what justice should look like. Thank you for choosing the truth over applause." No name, just the initials, KR. Benjamin read the note twice, then a third time. He didn't frame it. He folded it carefully and placed it in the inner lining of his briefcase, where it would stay, tucked beside his trial notes and legal codes. A quiet reminder of the kind of lawyer he wanted to be. The courthouse janitor, an older man named Wallace, saw Benjamin walking in one morning with a box of papers under his arm. "You look taller," Wallace joked. Benjamin smiled. "Maybe I just stopped shrinking." The two men shared a quiet moment. In a system where people often moved fast and forgot names, that exchange meant something. Benjamin had made it his mission to remember. The clerks, the bailiffs, even the defendants who never spoke. Everyone mattered. He launched a community series on weekends, offering free legal education in local libraries, not just for people facing charges, but for families, mothers, fathers, siblings, who didn't understand how court worked and were too ashamed to ask. One Saturday, after finishing a workshop, a boy approached him with a crumpled newspaper clipping. It was from the trial. Keanu's face barely visible behind sunglasses, Benjamin in the background, mid-step. "Is this you?" the boy asked. "It was," Benjamin said. "But now I'm just Ben." The kid looked confused. "Why don't you do more of this? The TV stuff. People should know." Ben shook his head. "Some stories are stronger when you don't talk over them." He turned back to clean up the whiteboard behind him. By that point, Benjamin had become a quiet hero in his community. Public defenders from across the state reached out for training materials. A law school asked him to guest lecture. He agreed, but only if he could bring his clients' voices into the room. One lecture featured a man who had served 2 years before his exoneration. Another included a mother who'd fought for visitation rights in a custody case involving wrongful arrest. Each story was raw, and Benjamin made sure none were edited for comfort. At the end of one session, a student raised their hand and asked what one thing had prepared him most for the Reeves trial. Benjamin paused, then answered softly, "Listening." A hush fell over the classroom. No legal jargon, no dramatic closing statements, just the simple truth of it. He left the building that day not as a man who had found fame, but as one who had found his calling. And as the wind tugged gently at his coat and he crossed the courthouse square, a passing street performer strummed a quiet tune on his guitar. Benjamin paused, listened for a moment, then dropped a folded bill into the case. The performer looked up, surprised. "Thanks, man." Benjamin just nodded and kept walking, briefcase in hand, that old letter still tucked inside, close to the heart where it belonged. Months had passed since the verdict. The courtroom, the headlines, even the viral clips had started to fade from public memory. But for Officer Simmons, the silence was not peace. It was consequence. After a series of internal reviews, the department gave Simmons a choice: resign quietly or face formal disciplinary action that could cost him his pension. He took the resignation. There was no press conference, no camera crews waiting, just a plain man in a rumpled uniform walking out of a precinct for the last time, carrying a cardboard box filled with the remains of a career built on authority and cracked by truth. His badge sat at the top of that box. Next to it, the body cam he claimed had malfunctioned. Below it, a crumpled notepad filled with old parking violations. Symbols of control, order, certainty. All meaningless now. He moved to a small town a few counties over, found a job in private security, told people he left the force by choice. He changed his name online, deleted his social media, but he couldn't delete the image in his head. The moment the courtroom saw the real story play out on screen. The moment the gallery gasped. The moment he realized he wasn't the hero of the story. For a long time he felt anger. At Benjamin, at the judge, at the jury, at Keanu. But mostly at himself. Then one night, sitting alone at his kitchen table, a pen in hand, he began to write. The words didn't come easy. They fought him, stumbled. But eventually, they flowed. "Dear Mr. Carter," he began, "you don't know me beyond the file. You probably never wanted to. But after everything that happened, there's one thing I owe: clarity. Not an apology. I know I don't deserve one of those, but maybe an admission." He continued writing, slowly, line by line. "I thought I was enforcing justice. That badge made me think I understood it, but I didn't. Not until I saw what justice actually looks like. It doesn't shout. It doesn't rage. Sometimes it just stands still and lets the truth catch up." He paused, looked at the page, then added another line. "Please, thank Mr. Reeves. I never realized who I was until the courtroom showed me. Thank you both for standing still long enough for the rest of us to see." He signed it, folded it, placed it in an envelope and mailed it to the public defender's office in Los Angeles. The letter arrived at the public defender's office during a rainy Monday morning. Benjamin Carter was reviewing a new stack of files when the receptionist placed the envelope on his desk. No return address, no markings except his name, handwritten with slow, deliberate strokes. He opened it cautiously, read the first few lines, and stopped. For a long time, he just stared at the paper. In his career, he had read countless letters, pleas, statements, testimonies, but never one like this. There was no legal language, no excuses, just a man's quiet confrontation with himself. A reflection that read more like a confession than anything else. Benjamin leaned back in his chair and exhaled. The rain tapped gently against the window behind him. He read the letter again, slower this time. And by the final sentence, he felt something stir in him that no courtroom win had ever given him. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Later that evening, he walked to a mailbox near his apartment. He didn't call Keanu, didn't send a text, just wrote a short note. "Thought you should have this." He placed it in a second envelope, along with the letter, and dropped it in. 3 days later, a small package arrived at Keanu's home in the hills, delivered without signature. Keanu recognized Benjamin's name immediately. He opened the envelope, removed the letter, and read it standing in the kitchen, sunlight casting long shadows across the floor. He didn't say a word. He read it once, then again. His eyes didn't narrow, and he didn't smile. He just folded it gently and walked to a drawer beside his study. It was the same drawer where he kept other letters, stories, some heartbreaking, others redemptive, all of them private. He placed the letter inside. There was no reply, no statement, no comment to the press, no phone call to Benjamin, and definitely not to Simmons. But what mattered most had already happened. For Keanu, words were never the measure of a moment. It was the silence that followed that told the real story. That drawer in Keanu's study held things no one else knew about. A child's crayon drawing from a hospital visit, a napkin with a scribbled "thank you" from a woman he once helped at a gas station, an old receipt from a diner where he quietly paid for every table's meal without ever being noticed. Now, the letter from Simmons sat among them. It didn't carry weight because of who wrote it. It carried weight because it proved something few people ever see: real change. And it didn't come with a headline, an apology tour, or a tearful broadcast. It came through a man who had faced the mirror and didn't look away. Simmons's words weren't polished. They weren't crafted for public redemption. They were raw, simple, honest. "I never realized who I was," he wrote, "not until the courtroom showed me. Thank you for standing still long enough for the rest of us to see." It wasn't absolution, and it didn't excuse the damage he had caused. But it was something, a spark in the dark. Benjamin never told anyone else about the letter. He never needed to. The story wasn't his to tell. It belonged to silence. The kind of silence that follows when the shouting stops and truth walks in quietly, asking no favors. And Keanu, he never brought it up again. He just lived, as he always had, by a rule no one ever taught him, but one he had written into the fabric of his life. You don't have to fight to be heard. Sometimes, you just have to stand still long enough for the truth to reveal itself. The courtroom was long behind him. The interviews had all been politely declined. The headlines faded into yesterday's news. And yet, the quiet truth still echoed. On a gray afternoon, Keanu walked alone down a side street in the city, wearing the same hoodie that started it all. No security, no fanfare. Just a man moving through the world without needing it to notice. Every step carried the weight of something unseen. But it wasn't regret. It wasn't resentment either. It was something gentler. The burden of restraint. Of knowing you could say more but choosing not to. He had always believed that silence, in the right hands, could be louder than shouting. And now, more than ever, he knew how true that was. Along the sidewalk, people passed him without a second glance. A couple laughed as they came out of a bakery. A young boy tugged at his mother's arm, asking for ice cream. Keanu watched quietly. There was something beautiful about not being recognized, about blending into a world that had nearly torn him apart just weeks before. Back at home, he kept a drawer, not filled with awards or scripts, but with letters, clippings. Things no one else had ever seen. That letter from Simmons, it joined the rest. Keanu hadn't responded, not because he didn't care, but because he understood that some moments don't require answers. Some apologies are better left to echo quietly between two people who will never meet again. What mattered most wasn't what happened in the courtroom. It wasn't the verdict or the headlines or even the viral videos. What mattered was that something shifted. Beneath the noise, beyond the headlines, people had seen something they couldn't unsee. A man stripped of his fame, treated like a stranger, standing tall with nothing but truth in his hands. In a local community center 2 neighborhoods away, a group of public defenders held their first training based on Benjamin Carter's outline from the trial. They didn't call it the Reeves Protocol. They didn't brand it. They just taught it. How to listen better, advocate with heart, and wait for the moment truth speaks on its own. One young lawyer whispered to another, "Did you hear who inspired this?" The reply came quietly, "Yeah, but he wouldn't want us to say his name." And in a modest apartment above a laundromat, a single mother who once lost her brother to a bad arrest sat watching Keanu's closing remarks for the 5th time. Tears filled her eyes, not because she was sad, but because for the first time in a long time, someone had stood still long enough for the world to see what it usually ignored. Some stories don't end with applause. They settle into people's lives quietly, like a seed planted in still soil, waiting for its season. That's what this had become. Not a performance, not a campaign, but a quiet shift in how people thought about justice, identity, and dignity. The trial had forced the nation to look at a question most were afraid to ask. What happens when the truth wears plain clothes and doesn't speak up for itself? In a small diner on the edge of town, 2 waitresses talked between shifts. One had shared the video on her page, the clip of Keanu standing before the jury, explaining why he never revealed who he was. "Because that's how the system should work," he'd said. The line had stuck. They didn't talk about movies. They talked about grace, about restraint, about how rare it is to see someone with every reason to shout choose instead to whisper. Meanwhile, Benjamin Carter, now back in his cramped office with paperwork stacked to the ceiling, looked at a new client file. It was a simple case, a mistaken ID again, but this time Benjamin didn't hesitate. He knew exactly how to approach it. Not with ego, not with noise, but with clarity. Because he'd seen what quiet conviction could do. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk, not of him and Keanu, just a shot someone had taken from the back of the courtroom where Benjamin stood beside his client as the verdict was read. No names, no captions, just presence. Elsewhere, the city continued on. The courthouse steps were bare. The reporters had moved on to newer stories. But something lingered. A change. Not in policy, but in perception. Keanu didn't start a foundation. He didn't launch a podcast. He didn't write a book. He simply got back to work. Filming. Writing. Visiting shelters. Listening. Walking. Just like he was on that first night, when all he wanted was to find his hotel. He passed a mural on the wall of an old community center. It hadn't been there the month before. The painting was abstract, almost impressionistic. A man in a hoodie, a courtroom in the distance. Hands, some clenched, some open, reaching forward. No signature, no explanation. But anyone who had watched the trial knew exactly who it was for. And yet the subject of the painting would never confirm it. He'd just keep walking. Because the real legacy wasn't the mural or the verdict. It was the conversations parents were having with their children. The questions jurors were asking themselves before casting doubt. The humility that now guided a young attorney's rising career. As the video draws to a close, the camera lingers on Keanu Reeves walking down a quiet city sidewalk. No fans trailing him, no flashing lights. Just a man in a hoodie, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed. Not from shame, but from peace. The world may know his name, but it never really knew his silence until now. No soundtrack plays, just the soft sound of footsteps against pavement and a breeze that carries the weight of everything said and unsaid. Then, one final question appears on the screen. Have you ever been judged too quickly or stood up for someone who was... A pause. Then a final invitation, calm but powerful. If you believe the truth should speak louder than assumptions, tell us what kind of story you want to see next with Keanu Reeves. The screen fades to black. No applause, no curtain call. Just a lingering sense that somewhere, somehow, the world shifted. Because one man chose not to fight back with power, but with truth.